When Nick Cater published The Lucky Culture, I don't know how many talks he's done, but quite a lot, yes. But what interested me was not so much the whole thing, well, which is interesting, but the first couple of chapters in particular I found fascinating, because he set out a picture of the founding of Australia that I hadn't actually read about or thought about in the same way as an Enlightenment experiment. But then, of course, if you go back to Banks and various others, of course, they all had that in mind. So when we have an annual conference each year in Queensland, and I asked Nick to perhaps, rather than talk about some other parts of the book, focus on that early part, because it fitted with the way we think about things at CIS. And I'm glad also tonight to see Supreme Court Judge Michael Pembroke here, who's just published a terrific biography of Arthur Phillip. And if you haven't read it, I have, you should get it. It's terrific, and it also sets out some of the ideas similar to the ones that Nick is going to be talking about. So it's my pleasure to invite Nick, now that he's a retired man from the media. He's been in Australia basically working for News Limited outlets for most of his working life in this country, and prior to that the BBC. But now he's finished one book and he's on his second, so perhaps tonight we can have him reflect on some of the important opening chapters of The Lucky Culture, which you can buy outside if you've got cash. Nick.
Well, thank you, Greg, for your invite and hosting this event, and to Megan and Peter and everybody for the CIS for organising it. And I'd heard that Michael Pembroke would be here, so I did bring along a copy of his book in the hope that he might autograph it. It is a wonderful read, and I picked up a couple of thoughts from that as I read it, which fed into the work that I'm talking about tonight. There's some other distinguished authors here. Michael Thompson, if you know, wrote a fantastic book about the Labour Party in 1999, and if you read it now, it's just like it was written yesterday. And yet the sad thing is that the Labour Party has heeded none of the very good advice that he offered then, and has suffered the consequences since. Lucy Sullivan, I gather, is here too. Lucy Sullivan wrote a book which I don't think has been given enough attention. It's a very important book called False Promises. It's a statistical, largely a statistical analysis of the consequences of the social or cultural revolution of the 1960s, and she does a superb job, I think, in demonstrating that many of the great promises that came out of that period of permissiveness have actually had adverse consequences that have been quite serious. It's an area of history which I think we'll come to unpack in greater detail as time goes by. But I think that's one of the yet untold stories of the 60s and 70s, is that these were not necessarily fantastic advances for mankind. In fact, some of them were arguably quite serious setbacks. That said, I'd better get on with my talk. And if you heard this before, I did speak on this subject at another event the CIS organised. I'd asked if we could just keep it to ourselves, because I learnt most recently, to my horror, that there is an academic crime now called self-plagiarism, for which you can be hauled before the board and ordered to grovel and apologise. I thought self-plagiarism was just repeating yourself, but apparently not. So I do apologise if you have heard any of this before. And I was grateful to Greg for picking this subject out, because it was one of the things as I researched the book that really excited me. One of those sort of fresh thoughts that came, that there's a whole new way of looking at Australian history. It's probably actually an old way of looking at Australian history, but for those of us new to this game, if you like, or relatively new, it's a revelation and a beautiful picture to see how the story of Australia fits right bang inside the story of the Enlightenment, that great period of thought, which really gave birth to the modern world as we know it, with all its many benefits. The Almighty got off to a disastrous start in the colony of New South Wales. The first fleet landed at Port Jackson on a Saturday, January the 26th, 1788. There was relatively little ceremony because the convicts and Marines had work to do. Watkin Tench, who was the great chronicler of that period, perhaps Australia's first journalist, described the scene. Business now set on every brow. In one place, a party cutting down the woods, a second setting up the blacksmith's forge, a third dragging along a load of stones or provisions. Here an officer is pitching his marquee with a detachment of troops parading on one side of him and a cook's fire blazing on the other. The following day, the Sunday, the First Fleet's chaplain, who I was interested to learn was a Methodist by the name of Reverend Richard Johnson, tried to gather together the men for a church service, but his appeals to the labouring heathens were ignored. They had work to do. The wilderness would not easily yield. A colony founded on this hitherto unbroken soil would not build itself. From the beginning, this was a place where man worked out his own salvation, and the first church service on Australian soil was not held until February the 3rd, 8 days after the First Fleet had landed. In an early letter home, the Reverend Johnson, who was actually an accomplished farmer as well, warns that Australia, spiritually as well as temporally, was a land of stony soil. Of the convicts, he writes, "They neither see nor will be persuaded to seek the Lord of mercy and the compassion of God. Most of them will sell their souls for a glass of grog." The construction of a church, needless to say, was low on the civic priorities. Although I did learn from Michael Pembroke's book that Governor Phillip commenced building his residence, I think within 5 months of arriving. Which is a magnificent building, with the only building in the colony with a staircase. The construction of a church, however, was considered fairly unimportant, and 5 years later the Reverend Johnson was still waiting, so he decided to build a temporary one out of his own pocket. The bill was substantial, £67 or so he claimed. There was some dispute about that when he tried to get reimbursement from the British government. There are arguments about whether he'd been quietly getting supplies out of the store and then charging for them. I'm sure that wasn't true. He was a man of the cloth after all, but he wrote a rather pitiful letter, I thought, to the Secretary of State in London, Henry Dundas. "Public works of different kinds have been and still continue to be so urgent that no place of any kind has yet been erected for the purpose of performing divine service. There has been too general and repeated neglect shown to public worship." He expressed his ardent desire to see the colonists attend more willingly and consequently more regularly upon the solemn and public worship of God. I'm sure Reverend Peter Curti understands that sentiment. The money was not immediately forthcoming. On one level, the godlessness of the convicts is easily explained, and the indifference of hardened Marines towards the divinity also is probably hardly surprising. But the attitude of Captain Arthur Phillip and his successors, the leaders and architects of the colony, after all, demands a deeper explanation, and it lies in the philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment. The Pilgrim Fathers settled the United States in 1620, which was in a very different cultural climate. The world of the early 17th century was a superstitious place in which science was a case of hit and miss, and witches were still hunted down. Francis Bacon was just piecing together the scientific method when he was struck down with pneumonia in an attempt to see what would happen if you froze food by going out into the snow. It was an era in which people relied on God for his benevolence. Consequently, the clergy, of course, played a very important role as the cultural elite. I was imagining perhaps Tony Jones presenting Q&A in 1620. Nobody else would have got a look in. The Pilgrims' tortuous journey across the Atlantic was very difficult. They had no means of determining longitude, and they arrived feeling sick and exhausted. When they sighted Cape Cod after the 66-day crossing, their leader, William Brewster, recited Psalm 100 from the deck of the Mayflower, Know that the Lord is God. It is he who has made us, and we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Their tribulations were only just beginning. They'd land in November, of course, was a shocking time to try and plant seeds. But by March 1621, 4 cold months later, half of the first pilgrims were dead from disease. They'd arrived, even surviving that harsh winter, though, was a miracle of sorts, because they had no means of understanding how to plant corn in that soil. It needed organic matter, of course, and nitrogen and potash. Any of us who've dabbled at gardening would know that instantly. But the science that gives us that knowledge, of course, was at least a century away. For the first year, the Puritans' utopia was a year in hell, a place of disease, starvation, and suffering. Nonetheless, in the autumn of 1621, they held a day of thanksgiving for the Lord's benevolence, and that was to become one of the 2 celebrations of American nationhood. Tom Hughes, it seemed to me, got it wrong. The eastern coast of the United States, not Australia, is the real fatal shore. In Australia, it was undoubtedly tough. This was not a land of abundance. It was a land of raw, untamed wilderness, where scratching a living in the early years of settlement was impossibly hard at times. But it was a country where man's fortune was not in the lap of the gods. It was in his own hands. In the history of colonial settlement, Australia and New Zealand stand apart. The rate of economic growth is astounding. The stability of their domestic institutions, civic institutions, the vibrancy of their civic life makes them stand-out success stories of the colonial project. The radical nationalists' historians' obsession with the brutality of those at the early days of settlement, I think, has badly distorted the Australian story. Australia was not a place of condemnation. It was a place of redemption. It was a place where earthly sufferings were not endured, but overcome. It was a place where man was in control of his own destiny. The ability of science to ease the friction of everyday life was apparent from the moment that the First Fleet set out from Portsmouth. Captain Phillip headed confidently towards the South Atlantic on HMS Sirius, which was equipped with the latest technology, a chronometer and a sextant issued by the Board of Longitude that would allow him to trace his path with some precision. Recent medical knowledge had helped ameliorate the threat of scurvy, although they didn't fully yet understand the disease. But Captain Phillip had persuaded the Admiralty to allocate some petty cash so that they could buy some supplies of fresh food along the way. The task of taming the continent was still to come, but the pioneers survived the 8 months journey in relatively good shape and would be able to draw on the advances of scientific agriculture, a field of study that had made rapid progress in ancient 18th century Britain. The first fleet included men with a working knowledge of applied agricultural science. Among them was a Cornishman who was a freelance housebreaker on the side, which accounts for why he ended up in Australia. Governor Phillip, desperate for men who might know think about farming, released him and gave him an acre and a half of land near Parramatta as an early experiment in self-sufficiency. Interestingly, Roos's story, although very inspiring to my mind, is not to be found in Tom Hughes' The Fatal Shore. Roos applied potash in the form of burnt timber, treating 8 or 9 rods of land a day. Watkin Tench wrote, "It was not like the government farm, just scratched over, but properly done." More than 150 years before Frederick Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, the lessons had already been learnt in Australia. He broke down the clods of soil by adding the only organic matter to hand, which was grass and weeds, and it slowly decomposed to release nitrogen. After the harvest, he sowed turnip seeds, allowing the ground to lie fallow for a year between crops, an adaptation of the 4-crop rotation system developed by Charles Turnip Townsend in Britain 50 years earlier. Now, within 18 months, Roos's blossoming smallholding had become an inspiration for what might be achieved. he was self-sufficient, not through the benevolence of an immense and eternal being, but through his own ingenuity and energy, the application of empirical science and its practical arm, technology. So a mere 3 years after the First Fleet's arrival, a criminal sentenced to hang in Britain had become the instrument of his own salvation, demonstrating that the colony of incarceration might be a land of liberty. The Enlightenment was man's coming of age, the emancipation of human consciousness from ignorance and error, and Australia was its proving ground. Insofar as the European settlers were missionaries, they bore testimony to the power of science. The explorers who forged the route through the Midwest of America were on a mission from God, but the explorers of inland Australia were men of science. Charles Sturt was dispatched to solve the mystery of the inland sea. John McDowell Stuart went in search of pastures and minerals. Strzelecki was a geologist who was employed to conduct a survey of Gippsland. And the ill-fated trip of Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills was commissioned by the Royal Society of Victoria as a scientific expedition. In the United States, it took a civil war for the values of the Enlightenment to prevail. But in the colonies of Australasia, the Enlightenment's narratives, scientific, economic and social progress would be written on a blank slate from the very start. Australian settlement was driven by the spirit of progress. It was the dominant narrative for most of our settled history. Reason, individualism and ingenuity were its hallmarks. Pragmatism and common sense were its guides. Progress, as it was understood in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, was an all-encompassing, unlimited project of improvement. It's distinct from the blinkered, limited perspective of progressiveness. For the 19th century classical liberals, the horizon was infinite. Scientific, technological, industrial, economic and social progress were interdependent and inseparable. For the modern progressives, of course, social progress is the chief and often only goal. Faith in science and industry is conditional. Their horizon stops with some blurred, intangible impression of a utopia. For the classical liberals, however, individual achievement would advance the public good. Its benefits would be universal. Humanity was in this thing together. One small step for man was capable of becoming one giant leap for mankind. For the social progressives, on the other hand, social progress alone serves the common interest. Economic and industrial success are private achievements, one to the detriment of others. In my recent book, The Lucky Culture, I traced the sudden and dramatic paradigm shift that occurred in Australia in the early 1970s, from the spirit of progress to the spirit of progressivism. It's a change that hit Australia, as I describe in the book, like a southerly buster, suddenly changing the climate of intellectual discussion. If I had to tinker with the book today, I think I'd speak of the spirit of sustainability, for that word, with all its implications of finite growth, limits to growth, stands in stark contrast to the infinite march of progress which Australians once believed. Anybody on the wrong side of 50, or perhaps I should say in this company on the right side of 50, will remember the very confident story of man's ascendancy that was once taught in schools. M.D. Williams wrote a school textbook called Out of the Mist, which was published in 1956, which characterised Australian settlement this way. The sound of the axe in that very thick wood was but the forerunner of a multiplicity of noises, the sound of roaring trains, whirring planes, chugging steamers and purring cars. It sounded the trumpet for the start of a mighty pageant, the pageant of civilization spreading throughout a land that had previously been a backwash. We can be justly proud of the achievements of our nation. Although Australia is young, much has been achieved. For the first 180 years of settlement, Australians sometimes argued about the path which they might take, or the divisions of the spoil, but the spirit of progress, with its unconditional faith in science, was seldom in dispute. 11 years before the First Fleet left Portsmouth. Adam Smith had written or had his book The Wealth of Nations published. It was a sensation. It sold out in 6 months. It was the clearest exposition yet of the new science of economics. So in the period between the voyages of Captain James Cook and the founding of the colony of New South Wales, Smith is pondering what would happen if a civilised nation was to take possession of a very thinly populated wilderness like Australia. And surely he could only have been thinking about Australia when he predicts that such a nation would advance more rapidly to wealth and greatness than any other human society. Smith goes on to explain why. The colonists carry out with them a knowledge of agriculture and other useful arts superior to what can grow up of its own accord in the course of many centuries amongst savage and barbarous nations. They carry with them, too, the habit of subordination, some notion of regular government, which takes place in their own country, of the system of laws, which support it, and of regular administration of justice, and they naturally establish something of the same kind in the new settlement. Had Smith visited the colony at the end of the 19th century, I suspect he would have been justified in saying, "I told you so." Tom Roberts' Golden Fleece, which was painted in 1894, is a record of the industrial progress in a country that had become hooked up to the expanding world economy. If you read the catalogue of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where the picture hangs, it describes the Golden Fleece as a conscious and generalised heroisation of the rural worker and his evocation of Australia as a new Arcadian land of pastoral plenty. Quite frankly, it's nothing of the sort. The shearing shed in Roberts' picture is a highly productive processing plant supplying a global textile and clothing industry. It was a collaboration of ingenuity on opposite sides of the world. In Britain, James Watt had re-engineered the steam engine at the end of the 18th century, and the Reverend Edwin Cartwright had patented the first power loom. The Factories Act, outlawing child labour, gave textile manufacturers an incentive to mechanise their plants. By the time Roberts painted the Golden Fleece, and that other great shearing image, the shearing of the rams, which hangs in the National Gallery of Victoria, the woolen mills of Yorkshire were mass-producing worsted by the acre, for which there appeared to be a limitless demand. This was the birth of consumerism. To talk of riding on the sheep's back is to suggest that we merely are passengers on the journey to a resource-based prosperity, when in fact we were the drivers. The ingenuity of George Pepin and other graziers had created the super merino that enabled Australia to corner the market for mass-produced quality wool. I was, as an aside, I was in Goulburn quite recently and came across the big merino, and suddenly for the first time realised what this symbolised. The earliest South African merinos that were imported here were very low yielding. By 1821, for instance, the average beast in the Camden Park flock would produce just 1.1 kilogram, about 2 pounds of coarse washed wool. By the end of the 19th century, a hardy, rugged, imported animal had been turned into a prolific fibre extrusion machine. And by the start of the 1890s, merinos in Riverina district were yielding an average of 4.6 kilograms of wool. If you're keeping up the numbers, that's a 400% improvement in productivity. Not only that, but it was wool that was so fine that it was being sold in the European markets under the name of the property, a bit like a French wine. The follicles of a single sheep would produce 100 million fibres a year, and it would be harvested annually by an itinerant gang paid according to the volume of their output. There was a very efficient logistics train, as we would call them today, although I don't think Lindsay Fox was involved at that stage. Bullock trains were the B-doubles of their era. They transported the bales to the coast, where they were loaded onto square-rigged clippers, capable of reaching Great Britain via the Suez Canal in 72 days, a third of the time it had taken the first fleet to make the journey. Decades before the arrival of superphosphate, another great scientific breakthrough transformed the soil, the Australian merino was enriched by the ingenuity and persistence of its breeders to become the mainstay of the economy. In the 1860s, wool was a $4 million a year industry. in the year the Golden Fleece was painted, 1894, it was earning $21 million for Australia, equivalent to 11.6% of the GDP. Meanwhile, the high cost of labour was driving technological change and a new inventiveness amongst the graziers. Shearing machines were being installed from the late 1880s. So efficient were they that a farmer could pay off his investment in a season and a half. They were designed and manufactured in Australia by an Australian by the name of Frederick Woolsey, who incidentally, his name went on to be given to a brand of motor car, although he wasn't responsible for that. His good friend Austin was. Woolsey took 20 years to develop the shearing machine because it needed a flexible drive mechanism so that you could get to all those awkward corners of the sheep. When he put his machine to the test at Euroka Station, the Argus reported that every practical man on the ground admitted the superiority of the machine over ordinary shears. Woolsey told a journalist, the shearer also has an advantage, of course, because he's able to shear greater numbers of sheep and consequently earn a larger cheque than he could by hand, while the labour is not nearly so severe and he's not called upon to stop work from bad wrists and so on. The Argus called this great technological breakthrough the death knell of the old colonial order. Woolsey's machine, it said, was quicker than 100 a day shearer, and any man may learn it in a week. Chinamen and rouseabouts and blackfellows will be shearers now. No more tar, no more strikes, no more second cuts, spoiling samples and staples, and 8 ounces more wool from every sheep. It was individual enterprise then, not government, that drove innovation in the 19th century. The demand for wool had created a corresponding glut of lamb and mutton, for which there was a ready demand in Europe, if only they could get it here. And if I may just plug another book, which is too little read, I think. A History of the Frozen Meat Trade by J.T. Critchell and J. Raymond. When I came across this, I thought I had to have a copy. And it is an inspiring read because it tells the story of the development of frozen meat and the ingenuity behind it. The Society of Arts had offered a £100 prize to find a way for preserving meat so it would survive the journey to the European market. There were 200 hopeful inventors who applied. Messrs. Medlock and Vailey claimed that by dipping meat in bisulfate of lime, anything of animal origin from a beefsteak to a bullock, from a whitebait to a whale, can be preserved sweet for months. The Reverend M.J. Barclay delivered a stirring address to the Society on the benefit of fungi. But somehow, Critchell and Raymond say, somehow the mushroom palliative failed to impress the committee as a substitute for the roast beef of Old England. Professor Gamgee suggested that the cattle should inhale carbonic gas at a cost of 2 to 3 shillings an animal before being slaughtered. Dr. Hassel proposed producing flour of meat by drying mutton in sulfuric acid, or sulfurous acid, I should say, for the scientists amongst us. The committee delivered a very gloomy report, and the prize went unclaimed. Once again, it was individual enterprise that got there. In 1874, the wool trader Thomas Sutcliffe Mort established the New South Wales Fresh Food and Ice Company as an adjunct to his wool business, and opened a freezing plant in Lithgow using ammonia compression technology. That was at the abattoir, and then he had another freezing plant here in Darling Harbour, and they were linked by rail. The following year, 1875, he organised a lunch for 300 people, and he announced after they'd eaten that the lamb they'd just eaten had been slaughtered 15 months earlier. He then delivered a stirring speech. I won't read it all because it's plainly time doesn't allow. But the message from here is that God only gets so far. A man has to finish the rest. He says, I feel, as I've always felt, that there is no work on the world's carpet greater than this in which I've been engaged. I say that the time has arrived, or at any rate is not far distant, when the various portions of the earth will each give forth their products for the use of us all, that the overabundance in one country will make up for the deficiency in another, that the superabundance in a year of plenty will serving for the scant harvest of a successor for cold arrests all change. God provides enough and to spare for every creature he sends into the world, but where the food is, the people are not, and where the people are, the food are not. The grand eloquence of that statement, the idea that he's engaged in what is essentially a business enterprise, and yet he sees this as part of the march of progress, the march of civilization that will benefit the whole of mankind, is an attitude which we'd think would be very odd today if it came from any of our present entrepreneurs. And yet it wasn't an idle boast. Unfortunately, Thomas More died before the frozen meat trade got going, but in 1879, 4 years after that speech, the Strathlevin sailed from Sydney to London with 40 tonnes of frozen meat on board, and it enabled the meat that was sold for between a penny and twopence a pound in Australia could be sold on the London markets for 3 times as much. A carcass of lamb was sent to Queen Victoria, and a sheep was sent to the Prince of Wales, but it wasn't just the rich and privileged who benefited. The British diet in the middle of the 19th century was a pitiful affair. People were starving, they were malnourished, women were unable to suckle their young. But frozen meat revolutionised the diet. Meat consumption rose enormously. In 1885, as the frozen meat trade was just getting underway, the average Briton was consuming 1.6 kilogram of meat a year. 10 years later, 1895, that volume had more than trebled. They were eating 5.6 kilograms of meat, and by 1910 it had more than doubled again, 12.7 kilograms in 1910. Critchell and Raymond, in this very exultant book, declare that the industry that hangs on the slender piston rod of a refrigerating machine feeds nations with a regularity that defies famine. This is the story of the resourceful, enterprising spirit of progress that has disappeared almost entirely from our national telling of our history. History has been remoulded to fit the progressive narrative that the late Kenneth Minogue compared to the legend of St. George and the Dragon. The sword first fell on the despotic kings and religious intolerance, then slavery, prison conditions, the state of the poor. In the 19th century, writes Minogue, the sword was never still, prodding this way and that against the scaliness of privilege, according to the progressive narrative. Maintaining this monotonous line of attack requires that we take a very dark, dim view of the past. Because if we acknowledge the virtues of our ancestors, we deny the great moral strides that we've assumed to have taken from darkness into light. The telling of one particular episode in our nation's history, I think, illustrates this point very well, and it's an indictment on the selective national memory. The word harvester, we all know, has become synonymous with Justice Henry Bourne's Higgins' 1907 ruling on the living wage, which was brought down in relation to the Sunshine Harvester factory in Victoria. The Sunshine Harvester itself, however, the product they actually made, is barely remembered. It was a technically advanced and efficient machine which would execute very efficiently the business of broadacre farming. We rarely hear the rags to riches story of Hugh Victor Mackay. He was the fifth of 12 children born to Irish immigrants in Victoria, raised in the Presbyterian tradition of the Free Church of Scotland. His harvesting machine stood up very well against competition from the American Midwest. He was employing a mass production line pretty much on a par with what Henry Ford was doing at the same time in Detroit. At its peak, the Sunshine Harvester Works employed 3,000 people and gave its name to an entire Melbourne suburb. Outside of Britain, it was the largest manufacturing exporter in the Commonwealth. Mackay took a paternal interest in his workers in the manner of the celebrated 19th century liberal industrialists of Great Britain, fielding cricket teams, forming the Sunshine Choir and building a fine stone church which is still in use today. Yet Mackay's achievements as Australia's most successful manufacturer are unlikely to be surpassed, but he's a casualty of our selective national memory. It's not surprising in a way, of course, that a pioneering nation should be a bit careless with its history. It's a future-orientated society that looks forward to the golden age, not back, and it's all the healthier for that. Yet I believe that it's vital that we recover our true national story and place it firmly in the context of the European Enlightenment. Some may choose to interpret what I'm saying as a call to reopen the history wars, but that's certainly not my intent. It's much more important than that. It's important, of course, that we do correct the black armband view of history and that we ensure that as far as our human frailties will allow, our telling of history fix the facts. The first obligation of historians, it seems to me, is the same as the first obligation of journalists, which is to report the simple, unvarnished truth. Yet it's also vital to put those facts in their context, because otherwise they are devoid of meaning. And I agree with John Hirst here that the Australian story, without reference to the European story, as the radical nationalists would want us to tell it, banishes our students to the Dark Ages. As Hirst says, without an understanding of the British and European history, the history of Australia is unintelligible. How can students understand secular liberalism and radicalism in Australia if they don't understand the Enlightenment? And I might add there, how can they grasp that Australia's luck was given and not made? And with that eternal truth planted firmly in the minds of without that eternal truth planted firmly in the minds of the next generation, can we blame them for assuming that our luck will simply continue, that our future prosperity is assured? Challenge of wealth is not how to earn it, but how to redistribute it. So I commend to the CIS the virtues of adopting an enlightened view of history, and I feel that I'm sowing this seed on very fertile ground, one that sees Australia neither as a dumping ground nor a place of colonial oppression, but the Enlightenment's most courageous experiment. And as the debate resumes now over the shape of the national curriculum with the election of a new coalition government, it seems to me few issues are more vital to planning for our future than the correct telling of our past. Thank you.